I am so excited to have Carol joining us. She is one of the best in the business, a PT that we should all aspire to be like. Not only an excellent clinician, but also very adept in sports science. And she came to teach for our organization earlier this year, actually last year, about nutrition and improving performance, and wanted to share her brilliance with the rest of you guys as well. So, with no further ado, Carol, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate that nice introduction. Thank you. And I'm excited to talk to you all tonight. My voice is going in and out. I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize if I don't normally sound this odd, but hopefully you can all see my screen. If you can't, let me know. But or just kind of maybe chime in here. I'm going to share
Yeah, we
here.
can see it.
All right. Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll get started here. So we're going to talk about nutrition. We're going to talk about the energy systems. Actually, I'm going to back up for a second. And we're going to talk about how those kind of tie together. So I'm going to go way back to start out when, I'm sure you all remember learning about this in biology class or exercise physiology class. But very briefly, we're going to talk about ATP and ATP production. The body needs a constant supply of ATP. So and this is what has to do with nutrition, because we are making ATP from either nutrients that we stored in our body from food that we've previously eaten, or food that we were taking in, during a long run for a quick source of energy. But the other thing to understand is we really don't produce energy. So if you remember from back in the day, probably from class, the law of thermodynamics, we are never really creating or destroying energy. We're just converting the energy stored in our food to make energy. Then that energy transfer fuels processes to form ATP and to actually break ATP apart into the energy that we can use. So just that little kind of background aside, we're going to go into energy systems here. So there's three sources that we have to convert ATP, and there's kind of basically our three kind of energy systems for exercise. So we have two forms of anaerobic ATP sources, where we have what we call the alactic anaerobic and the lactic anaerobic. We'll talk about what each of those are in a second. And then we have aerobic oxidation. And there's kind of a continuum of these. So I'm going to skip to the next slide. You can see as exercise duration increases, the contribution to the aerobic system increases. And this has to do with, one, from when we think about training mechanisms that we put our patients through, and different things that, if you're out of a sport for a certain amount of time and it is a sport with a big aerobic component, just different ways of understanding how we train them while they're rehabbing, but then also in terms of fueling, which we'll get to towards the end. I'm going to explain these a little bit more closely in a second. I'm going to take a sip of water. I'm sorry about my voice today. So the phosphagen system, the first kind of anaerobic energy system, this is also called the ATP PCR pathway, or sometimes I've seen it as the ATP PC pathway, however you kind of want to call it. This is the first system to kick in when we start exercising. This is like our first 10 seconds of exercise. This is where we have ATP, which is the adenosine triphosphate. There's 3 bonds there. We just cleave off one of those bonds with one of those phosphate bonds using creatine kinase, and that is a quick source of energy. And this is how we fuel things like Olympic weightlifting, swinging a baseball bat, throwing a shot put, 100-meter sprint. The only problem is we have a limited supply of ATP and phosphocreatine, and so this capacity is very limited. So we run out of our stores of this in the first 10 seconds. From here, we move into the second kind of pathway for anaerobic metabolism. This is glycolysis. If you remember this from, again, exercise phys or biology class, I remember having to memorize the steps of this, and I hated doing it. We don't have to really talk about those steps here, but just understand that this takes over after we run through that, those first stores of phosphocreatine. This is, if you think about like a 400-meter sprint, it's kind of the perfect example of using glycolysis. This is like where we end up 6 to 30 seconds, even a minute. We'll look at a graph in a second about this. But this is where we're breaking down our stored muscle glycogen. And then we end up with either one of two things. We end up with good old pyruvate, if you remember that. We'll talk about that in a second, or lactate. So if we're working out in an anaerobic pathway, we end up with lactate. We can measure lactate to measure how somebody is doing in terms of anaerobic workouts, taking like a blood sample. We can also look at lactate accumulation to see kind of where they are at in that. But I also, as a little bit of a review from exercise physiology, this creates lactic acid, but that is not actually the source of muscle burn when we're working out. It's actually the hydrogen ions that cause the fatigue and muscle burning. So it's not a lactic acid buildup that causes the muscle fatigue and the burning that causes you to stop exercise. Anyway, just want to digress with that. But after 90 seconds of doing intense exercise, we have kind of hit our capacity for the anaerobic pathway, and then we have the aerobic system taking over. And when we have that, we have, after that glycolytic pathway, that pyruvate that's made gets put over to the wonderful Krebs cycle. And that creates the oxygen, or that uses oxygen to create the ATP that we need for aerobic exercise to keep moving forward. When we look at this on a continuum, we can see that, from 30 seconds to even past the minute mark, we've got more of the glycolytic pathway fueling our exercise. And then from there, we start to have more and more of the aerobic pathway taking over. And what that means, I'm going to talk in a second about, I'm going to skip back for a second. What that means is, first off, when we are looking at rehabbing athletes, I think it's really important to understand the fitness level that they need to get back to, from a standpoint of if there's anything that we can do to maintain the fitness that they are going to need to get back to their sport, because it does them a disservice to completely shut down an athlete and then expect them to not only, while we're rebuilding strength, the range of motion, or whatever those things are from the rehab perspective, but then from the conditioning perspective, as we're throwing them back into their sport, if we've not developed what their fitness is, we could be putting them at risk for either another injury or overuse injury or reaggravation of certain injury because they don't have that fitness base. So any type of cross training that we can get, that you can get an athlete doing while they're out, following some of these energy systems that they need to get back to, is really important. For example, if I have an athlete, like I work with the track team at the high school that I take care of, if I have a sprinter with an injury, I'm going to treat that fitness base a lot different than when I have one of our distance runners. So one of our distance runners, I can send for longer kind of cross training, like let's say they have a stress fracture, like non-impact activities, and have them be doing longer duration kind of aerobic workouts. Where if I have that sprinter, I'm going to have them cross training where we're doing like sprint intervals if tolerated with their injury, depending on what their injury is. But that's very important. One other energy system, though, that I'm going to skip back to and I want to talk about is if we have team sports. So if we have basketball, soccer, lacrosse, we just started lacrosse season here in Ohio. It's a spring sport for us. Those use all three energy systems, and it's something called repeated sprint ability. So what that means is you have these kind of max of sprints where the athlete has to get down the field or down the court, and then you have these brief recovery periods. And so when we look at that energy continuum, if you had an athlete that was just doing one single sprint and they weren't, playing a team sport, so think of that track athlete that runs the 200-meter dash, there's not a ton of aerobic involvement in the energy system that they're kind of tapping into, or to fuel that activity. But when we have repeated sprints, there's more and more of an aerobic contribution because you're having to just sustain activity for a longer period of time. So just understanding, so somebody, if I was having a soccer player cross train, I would do like repeated sprint ability on a bike versus that long, slow distance bike ride that I would have for like a cross country runner do. What that brings us into it, and if you guys have questions too, by all means, like let me know. We've got that time for question and answer at the end. But what this all kind of is a good segue right into, we talk about nutrition, but the substrate that we use, so whether we are using like an anaerobic pathway or an aerobic pathway, it also has to do with what we use in terms of carbs versus fat to fuel our workout. So right now, you guys are all sitting listening to me give this talk. At rest, right now, you're burning the majority of the fuel that you're burning, just to sit and listen, is coming from fat. As our exercise intensity increases, so as let's say you got up, you're sitting right now, you're burning fat. Maybe you were going to get up and you're going to go for a walk around your house. You're probably still going to be burning fat. But let's say something happens downstairs and you jump up and you go to sprint downstairs. That you're going to start to tap into more carbs for a fuel source. So as our exercise intensity increases, or like if you're having somebody, do those sprint intervals that I mentioned, the odds of them, burning the majority of their burning the majority of carbs to fuel that is very, very high. So when we think about telling athletes how we need to fuel, we'll talk about carbs versus fats versus protein starting right now. It's important to understand. So that's my lead into carbohydrates. So carbs are very good. Carbs get a bad rap, but carbs actually are the preferred fuel of the body. It's the brain's preferred source of energy. If we had to, in a dire need, if you were not taking in any carbs, the brain could do kind of a secondary pathway to burn fat as an energy, but they would have to go through a lot of extra steps to do that. It's a more efficient fuel source. It requires less oxygen to be metabolized than fat, so it's just more efficient that way. And it's the only food nutrient that can fuel those anaerobic workouts. So we thought, again, the anaerobic kind of short burst workouts, we need carbs to fuel that. Fat cannot fuel that. So just understand carbs are a good thing. We're going to go into a little more detail about like the logistics of like carb loading and different things at the end. I just want to kind of quickly talk about carbs, fat, and protein metabolism before we do that. So fat metabolism. Fats are typically stored as triglycerides. These are very energy dense. So we can, like in one triglyceride molecule can fuel us for a lot longer than actually a carb. A carb is a quicker source of energy. It also enters the blood several hours after eating, so it's a slower source of energy. So you could potentially have a meal that has a decent amount of fat in it earlier in the day, and it could potentially be used for your workouts later on in that day. Most of our sources of fat are actually a combination of saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and monounsaturated fat. We'll talk about in a second. Saturated fat kind of has gotten a bad rap in the press and in popular media. We went on this kind of low fat craze for a number of years, and we actually never really got much healthier. The optimal combination of fat that we actually need to have is a third polyunsaturated, a third mono, and actually a third saturated fat. This actually creates and the way that these are classified are how the chemical bonds, not to get into the detail, I'm not really a chemistry person, as I'm sure maybe the majority of PTs are not either, but just understanding that if our body takes in a combination of these, it actually is better for the body and it helps support our immune system. It actually manages inflammation and it's better for our hormones that way. So we really do need a combination. Eating a diet that is free of saturated fat actually is counterproductive. So as I mentioned, saturated fats that are found in beef, pork, lamb, actually don't necessarily cause heart disease. We thought years ago that they would, and we had this kind of public health kind of movement to get away from doing that, but actually we did not get healthier. We actually gained more weight because we substituted eating low fat things with things that had a lot of chemical additives and extra sugars, and that kind of backfired on us. If depending on the fuel source, and it's probably a much wider conversation for a different time, but where you're getting your meat from makes a difference, not that you're eating the meat, unless you have a different plant-based diet or something that you're on. That's a separate conversation. I'm going to talk briefly about omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. So omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. You see them in supplements that are out in stores. They help manage inflammation. So helps with pain, helps with preventing blood coagulation, helps keep cell membranes fluid, helps our immune system, which clearly maybe I need a few more omega-3s in my diet this week. Omega-6 are pro-inflammatory, and they do the opposite effect. And we actually need both in our diet But the issue is that we tend to get more omega-6s in today's current diet in, the 2000s or even the late, the 1990s and the 1980s. Our ratio used to be a lot more balanced where we had, a 2-to-1 or even 8-to-1 in favor of omega-6. Right now, it's almost 10-to-1 or 20-to-1. So things that have higher omega-6s are processed foods. If you're all eating only one kind of like animal food, that's going to swing it in favor of omega-6. So if you need to, or if you have somebody that is managing an inflammatory condition or an injury, they may want to consider omega-3 supplementation. I'm obviously not a dietitian, and you can kind of, I would defer to a dietitian if you have a question about any of the things I'm talking about. But just want to get the point across to that omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. All right, moving on to protein here. So protein is not really a common source of energy. It is important for us to take in though. This is what helps us make transport proteins, helps with cell signaling, enzymes that can help catalyze different things for muscle recovery or regenerating muscle or building muscle, helps our immune system. Our body is always breaking down and building new protein. We actually can't store it in our muscle or in our liver the way that we can store carbs and fat. So we always need to be taking in protein. I think right now, these days, protein is a little more popular than carbs and people, the low carb diet. I really want you guys to understand that our bodies need a varied source. We need protein. We need carbs to fuel our workouts, and then we also need fats. All right, that was a very quick overview of macronutrient metabolism. We're going to go into water and hydration very quickly, and then kind of go back into the logistics of how and when to eat, workout timing, and that kind of thing, and then we'll take questions. So when we go into looking at water and hydration and looking at fluid needs, you can estimate it best by body weight, and then we'll talk about when those needs might go up or go down. But for every kilogram of body weight, you need about 30 to 40 milliliters of water. So for like a 110-pound person, that's like 1.5 to a little over 2 liters a day. If somebody's 220 pounds, a little bit heavier, you need like 3 to 4 liters. When we are dehydrated, the percentage of body water loss and the consequences are pretty important to understand. So if we have somebody who's working out on a very hot day, doing very heavy training, they really need to be hydrating. So if we're losing even a 0.5% of our body weight in water, we're having an increased strain on the heart. And then from there, we start to lose, aerobic endurance, muscle endurance, and then the situation gets more and more dire. The issue is that we don't typically notice thirst until we've lost like 1 to 2% of our body water. There's a lag between our thirst and when we've already lost water. So it's really important to pre-hydrate before activities when we're going to be sweating a lot, or again, exercising in a hot climate, that kind of thing, or exercising for a very long time. I do need to mention, especially if there's residents taking the sports certification exam or doing anything involving emergency response, this is really important because as I'm talking about drinking lots of water, we need to understand that there's hyponatremia at play as well. So hyponatremia is where we have too much liquid relative to the solute. So dehydration, where we've lost kind of body fluid and we have a kind of increased buildup of like salt. This is the opposite, where we're taking in too much fluid and we're diluting the electrolytes in our body. And the initial symptoms of this can sometimes be mistaken for dehydration, especially when your first instinct is the person hasn't drank enough water, and then we'll say, it's hot out, keep drinking water. Well, maybe that person did prehydrate way too much and they didn't take in any electrolytes. The time when this becomes an issue is when they're just drinking straight water, they've been exercising for a long period of time, losing electrolytes, and then they're not rehydrating. So just understand that fluid replenishment is very, very important, but don't overdrink. If you are working out for longer than an hour, you need to have an electrolyte to supplement too, just so that you're not way over diluting. But if somebody is just working out under normal conditions, short bouts of exercise, plain water is usually probably fine. Ways to figure out how to hydrate. You can have the athlete do something called sweat rate calculation. There's a link here. I'll send out these. I can send these out afterward, so you can have that link, or you can even screenshot it here. But you can calculate the sweat rate of an athlete, meaning that you can have them weigh in without clothes and just record their weight, and then run or exercise for about 60 minutes without drinking water. Obviously, don't do this on like a very hot day where you put somebody at risk, but then weigh it again. And then for every pound loss, that's 16 ounces of fluid. And so to replace each pound, you actually need 20 ounces of fluid to kind of overshoot that. And then I'm going to kind of go through these hydration strategies pretty quickly, as I'm hoping this is just a reference for you all. As I mentioned, I can send out these slides afterward. But basically, you want to start out well hydrated before you're exercising. And then again, if you're training greater than an hour, if it's a really hot day, or if it's somebody that's a very salty sweater or a heavy sweater, they should supplement with an electrolyte drink. During exercise, you want to keep drinking water, keep drinking fluids. Again, if you have a higher sweat rate, you may want to change around how the parameters for that electrolyte drink. Again, this is a I'm going to kind of skip through these kind of quickly, but this is a reference for you. And then after exercise, you want to continue drinking. You want to drink enough to recoup that sweat loss. You can add on things like carbs or sodium to kind of rehydrate quicker. You want to add in extra protein after an intense workout to help with recovery. And then if you are even trying to gain weight, you can even add more calories to that. And then speaking of, we're going to go into again the post-workout nutrition and kind of bring back in some of the carbs and protein that I mentioned earlier. So there are new protein recommendations for all athletes. So this is, and I believe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, if they've taken the NSCA exam, but I believe this was part of the CSCS certification now. So again, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are the new recommendations. So all athletes should be ingesting like 1.4 to 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight a day. So you could calculate the athlete's weight in kilograms and multiply it by a factor of 1.4 to 1.8. The old recommendations that were endurance athletes needed less protein than strength athletes, and we found that is no longer the case. Sometimes if you don't want to get into the weeds of calculating, you can also just give people hand size portions as just recommendations for serving sizes. This I find to be very helpful kind of with the general patient. And a lot of times this is hard enough just to make sure that they are getting at every meal 1 to 2 servings of protein that would be the size of your palm, vegetables that would be the size of your fist, carbs being a cupped handful, and fats being a thumb size. Once they master this and you need a little bit extra guidance, you could start going back to like the protein recommendations that I mentioned earlier with when you're looking at body weight. But I would actually recommend for like the majority, probably 90% of people, even athletes, just mastering kind of, again, getting the right portions, just using your hand is great. Then again, you can add more on. But the nice thing about hand size is for a bigger person, they have a bigger hand. So their hand size portions, it just kind of moves with them instead of having to calculate, different body weights, that kind of thing. And as I mentioned, most people, it's enough to do this. The other thing that for most people, it's enough to just counsel them to make sure that they're eating carbs at most meals enough to support their activity level, and that they are getting protein, at least 1 to 2 servings of protein at each meal, and that they're eating every 3 to 4 hours. I work with, as I mentioned, it's lacrosse season, and I work with a high school. We just had practice begin, and we just had a girl that was feeling lightheaded at practice that was at 7 o'clock at night, and we asked what was the last thing she ate, and it was breakfast. So just making sure that people eat appropriately, or maybe I had a busy day full of meetings yesterday, and the person that I was running from meeting to meeting with was talking about she just hadn't had time to eat. I kind of brought food to my one meeting. It was kind of rude that way in eating, but like sometimes you just have a busy day that, for the people that are like working and then going to work out after work, it's an important reminder for them to make sure that you fuel before that exercise or your rehab session.
Hey, Carol, we had a
Yep.
question from Erica. She asked, aren't there new recommendations for older athletes that are greater than they have been before?
That's a great question. I do not have the exact numbers of those, but they are, because in a good way we're getting to understand that like older athletes need protein to fuel their exercise. And so we're starting to have a better understanding of that. And as older people are, people are being active more into old age, uh, that is becoming more of a that's becoming more into our awareness. So we're starting to have like better numbers on that. But yes, I do not
Thank
have
you.
those exact numbers though.
Great.
Yeah, great question. And yeah, if anybody else has other questions, let me know. I can't see because my screen's on a full screen, but if
It's
there's
all
any,
good. I got you.
perfect. And we'll have some time too, um, after this too. After I'm gonna go through the next few slides pretty quickly. You can adjust different serving sizes for, again, length of activity, intensity, if you're doing multiple sessions a day, different people's goals, or even food tolerances, because some people just can't eat, close to activity. And along those lines too, we think about pre-workout nutrition. We can do a couple things. We can either eat 2 to 3 hours before a meal, and this we have time because we have 2 to 3 hours for our body to digest. This is where we'd want to have like more of a balanced meal. We'd still want carbs, but those are quicker to digest. You want some protein and fat, but those, as I mentioned, take longer to digest. So you don't want to eat like a very fatty meal. Even if you have 2 to 3 hours, it's still not enough time to digest those things. You want to be lower in fiber because you don't want to give yourself a stomach issue before a workout. And by doing that, limiting vegetables. There are some examples here. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, but you can kind of screenshot this or I'll send it out. But then let's say you don't have a ton of time, in your day, and you're just eating 30 to 45 minutes before, or this is your normal routine because this is how you feel best about, fueling your workouts. At this point, your food should be easier to digest. So we're looking at like simpler carbs, not a complex carb, things with very, very little fiber and a small amount of protein and fat. A little bit's okay, but you don't want a lot. So things like, a banana and nut butter, or like a carb bar, something like that. Let's say you were eating immediately before. This is where you want simple sugars. This is where you want fruit snacks, jelly beans, banana, applesauce, like a dried fruit, the gels that you can get at running stores. Those work really well. So we're trying to get just a very quick carb source to fuel your exercise, to be able to let the body produce ATP very quickly. When we're in workout, so if you are doing an activity that lasts over an hour, so people that are doing a long run, a long bike ride, multiple, like a very long soccer game or football game, eating a simple carb every hour, or like at halftime if you're playing a team sport, that's important. If you are running and you're running a marathon, getting carbs in every 20 to 30 minutes are important. If you're have an activity that's lasting over 2+ hours, so well into the marathon or marker triathlon or that kind of thing, then you may want to add a protein as well. And so here are some examples here of what 30 grams of carbs will look like. Excuse me. And then post-workout, we really want to be we really want to be thoughtful about what we eat after our workout, especially if we're thinking about the rehab realm. So you've just worked really hard, to build back a person's muscle mass. Let's say it's a person with ACL surgery and you're really working their quad. We want to make sure that we fuel the ability for our body to, have that quad kind of rebuild. So we want to make sure that we do the right thing for protein turnover to happen there. And so we need to have protein in our post workouts, but then we also need carbs because we've used carbs as that energy source. So we need to replenish that. But then also we need, again, that protein to help rebuild. So there's kind of this window of opportunity where protein synthesis would kind of be in that window where our muscles are primed to kind of accept, like our muscles want those nutrients to be able to be as substrates or building blocks for repairing. And that's the 1 to 2 hour window. So we're going to keep rebuilding for about 48 hours after exercise, but if we're with 1 to 2 hours afterward, getting protein in is the most important. So that's that window of opportunity. So examples of this, so within 30 minutes, having like a protein drink and pretzels, so we're getting carbs and protein bar and a sports drink, fruit and nut butter. Those things are all really important to help get refueling both of those pathways. And then you can, within 2 hours, get a little bit of a bigger meal would be important as well. And so there's examples here too, like a turkey sandwich or Greek yogurt, that kind of thing. And this is where we'd be increasing even more carb and protein source. All right, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen here. Those are the ends of my questions, or my slides. I'm happy to take questions now here.
To kick it off, we had a question that is there a difference in taking a protein shake pre or post workout? Is one better in your opinion?
It'd be a matter of how close you take it to the workout. So if it's a protein shake, and it's important to look at the nutrition, like how many grams of protein it is. If it's a shake that has a high amount of protein, you may not want to take it super close to your workout, because it's going to take your body a longer time to digest. So if it's a protein shake and it's 2 hours before your workout and has like a good serving of protein in it, that's probably fine. But if it's something immediately before, it should be like more of just a carb source. Protein shake after a workout is a great thing.
We had a couple questions right off the bat on recommendation on creatine supplementation for training and performance.
I'm glad you guys asked that. I actually took the slides out from that just because I was worried about time-wise. Creatine supplementation is shown to be pretty safe. There's even some small evidence that even younger kids. Now, I'm not a dietitian, so I would defer to like a physician or dietitian. But there is some evidence out there that it's not as bad as anyone can kind of take it. It really can be a good thing to help with muscle when you're trying to have strength gains. There is the side effect of like bloating. So if you have somebody that is really worried about their weight and water retention, that's kind of one of the bigger side effects for it. So you just have to kind of counsel people with that. But yes, I think creatine supplementation for somebody that wants to do it, or if you're somebody, if you're working with somebody that really needs to put on muscle mass and they are interested in doing that, I think it's perfectly okay to do.
And Kelsey asked, when did you get your CSCS? And how do you think it's impacted your outlook on rehab? Are there any blurred lines between the CSCS scope and the PT scope?
Yeah, great question. I got mine in PT school, which was a very long time ago. I graduated PT school in 2006, so I got mine in 2004. I'm looking at I don't know, my certificate on the wall. 2004, 2005. I actually took it when I was in school because I had an orthopedics course that had all the foundations for the exam, and our professor said, if you're going to take it, you should take it now. And so that I've gotten it a long time ago. It's impacted my outlook on rehab a lot. I've come from a strength and conditioning background, so I actually when I was in college, I did an internship at a Division I school, and I played college soccer. So I've always kind of came at the PT world from the training world. So for me, everything is very blurred. When I look at my PT scope of practice, it is very rooted in strength and conditioning, and how much can we build strength. I'm more of a kind of from that line versus manual therapy. I'm more on the strength spectrum than I'm less skilled.
Love it.
My manual skills are not great.
There's a lot of research supporting that approach, so it sounds like you're on the right track. Sam asks, would you adjust the portion based on the weight of the teenager? If yes, what is your recommended ratio? And I think I'm trying to see what that's recommended. I think that may be related to creatine, perhaps.
Yeah, I would if it was creatine, yes, I would. I would look up, and I would also double check. Like I said, technically the recommendation is 18 and over for creatine. Like I said, there's some evidence out there that those recommendations may be a little too stringent, but I would always just like more of a cover myself thing. If it's a teenager, I would go back and like either cover myself by asking like a dietitian, or just to say that you've like and then at that point, the recommended ratio. But yes, I absolutely would adjust the portions. But just
Emily
make sure that
asks, are there any different or specific recommendations on nutrition when recovering from concussion?
yes. There there are and there are some dietitians out there. I want to believe it's like I I can't remember her name, but there's a social media account of a dietitian that actually specializes in rehab and recovery, and one is from concussions, and one is ACL, so the nutrition needs for that. Um, in terms of things that I tell people, so important to maintain your carbs. So the brain's preferred fuel source is carbs. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining your carb intake. Now, you may not need to have the extra fuel for a workout if their activity levels reduced because of concussion. So like all the pre-workout nutrition, making sure that you're getting in extra carbs, you may not need to do that, but you want to really make sure that they are getting it 1 to 2 servings of carbs at every meal.
This one's a good one. Is there a difference between drinking your protein, aka shakes, and
Yeah.
eating your protein? Which would you say is
Great one. The It depends on how close you are to a workout. So if you are, as you get closer to a workout, you'd want to drink your protein because it's easier to digest. So you could, your body can break it down faster. Um, if if you have more time, so if it's earlier in the day, eating your protein would be better.
for someone who's just starting creatine supplementations, is there a recommendation to have a loading phase?
Yes, yes, there is a recommendation. So I believe, and I have to double check now. I believe it's the first week or first 5 days that there is a loading phase for that.
Next question, what is your thought on supplementing with BCAAs?
So when I first did my nutrition certification, BCAs were kind of the rage, and so the thought was that they were a little bit easier. They were better for the body. One, they were a little bit easier to digest, but also the body could use them as a better fuel source because they're already and BCAs, for anybody who's unfamiliar, are branched chain amino acids. What they found now is that they don't seem to have as much of an effect as just getting a good source of protein in general. So just making sure that you're getting protein from varied fuel sources, so meat sources, beans, that that actually is going to be better off in the long run.
Next question, what are your thoughts on different protein sources like vegan versus whey? Or are you just looking for an amino acid profile?
That's another great. That was another slide that I took out for time's sake. So I'm glad we're asking about this. Um, there are not all protein sources are created equal. So we have when our body protein made up of amino acids. There are certain amino acids that are only found in meat, unfortunately. And so we do need to find a way if you are vegan that you need to kind of supplement those amino acids. So there are different protein sources. The other thing is some of those vegan protein sources, which I used to kind of counsel my patients to just get a vegan source. It might be a cleaner source. And what I mistake I was making when I was telling them that is um, a lot of those sources don't really have the same amount of grams of protein as like a whey protein does. So you would need to take a lot more of it. Also, it's different amino acids, so you're not really getting the complete spectrum. If somebody is like, a plant-based person for, there's a lot of reasons that somebody would need, that would be doing that. And I don't disagree with their reasoning for doing that, but they would just have to work a lot harder to get those sources of protein. Um, so it's important to understand that. Same with if you're just eating tofu on a daily basis versus eating a meat source. You need a lot more tofu or a plant-based protein source to get the recommended amount of a protein that you need per day.
Good segue. The next question is, what if you don't meet your protein goal one day? Should you then the next day overcorrect and try to get more protein that day? Is that good, or would you not recommend that?
It's a good, it's a great question because that's kind of what daily life, like, sometimes we just, for whatever reason, you may not get I think we all, and most people, things happen, or you eat something, it just doesn't happen to be as rich in protein as you think. Yes, you can aim for more protein the next day. It's not ideal, it's not the perfect thing, but at least you are, allowing your body, especially, if we talk about your protein synthesis goes for 48 hours after a hard workout. So even though you're not in that window of opportunity, there's still a window to rebuild and to help the body recover. So yeah, you could do that.
Next question, any insight on recent research supporting creatine as a supplement for people with a history of concussions or TBIs?
Oh, that's a great question. I very like I've skimmed the surface on this. Like I've seen a couple things out there about it. I haven't done a deep dive into the studies that show it. Uh, there's a lot of research coming out on creatine, on the benefits of creatine. There's I work at John Carroll University, the exercise science department, and two of the professors I work with are huge proponents of their exercise physiologists, huge proponents of creatine, for a lot of reasons. It does help with recovery, like muscle recovery from a workout. So, it does make sense with, the body trying to recover from things, and TBI, where the body's just, trying to recover from that. So it does, again, it does make sense, but I've not gone through like the methodology of those studies to critique them yet.
All right. And last question on the board at the moment is, how do you combat socioeconomic status, especially considering pediatrics, and helping them appropriately fuel their body through the rehabilitation process?
Yeah, this is a great and very real question. Um, yeah, and especially considering in pediatrics where, you know, what they have access to maybe very different from person to person. Um, the way I would try to do that is first just try to meet them halfway. So like you're trying to work with the patient in front of you, I guess is a better, maybe not even meet them halfway. Try to work with the patient in front of you. So you kind of look for little wins. So yes, in an ideal world, would would we have that person, appropriately, eating a balanced meal, with the right servings at every meal, eating before they exercise, post workout fueling, yes. Um, would I try to just start with like the first kind of little win of, you know, are they eating enough meals a day? They may or may not be, depending on, what they have access to. So one, if you can just try to, education goes, a bit of a way. Two, sometimes it's like, I'm just happy for you to get some of a meal in. Am I going to be upset if you're eating a meal that has a lot of processed food in it, or a meal that is, a little bit lower on one of the macronutrients? Like I'd rather make sure that you just get calories, or whatever we feel like we can kind of work with that person. It's important to do that, and just, either build from education, or just build from, or see if you can link them up to, are there different services that can get them access to resource, are there, does the school have, different services available, or that kind of thing. Great question though.
Love it. Yeah, I think using community-based services is a huge one, and there are a lot of them out there. So educating yourself on those is a huge one. Another question popped up. Do you have preferred protein shake brands or recommendations for older populations in particular?
Um, it depends, and I'm sorry if you hear my dog just going crazy downstairs. It Yeah, I always see Ensure as well. Don't know so like even older populations, like I would sometimes I would look to even like the things that are fueling like the fitness people, like the endurance athletes or different things, because those are like sources of carbs and proteins that are a good thing for, everyone. So I think you could, yeah, I see it, and I actually have a family member who had cancer and a stem cell transplant. She was in the hospital, and she's very big on like not having processed food, but the only thing she could hold down was Ensure. They were giving it to her in the hospital, and she was talking about like how she would just love a different supplement that's not that. We were looking at that point of what are scratch, which is like something that is made for endurance athletes, like scratch gel mixes or that kind of thing. So I think you can kind of look beyond, like look into the fitness industry and look for like protein shakes that way. And those are other options even for the older population.
And one more question, are there different protein recommendations for someone who's recovering from surgery, i.e. total joint replacement, etc.?
Yes. So somebody who's recovering from surgery, I I would actually put them like more towards the protein recommendations for like athletes. So they were on that slide. I could send out those sources if we need to, versus the typical, like I mentioned, like the palm size, or sorry, the fist palm size of your protein. Um, so you could go by body weight and just kind of treat them a little bit like more like an athlete, like the 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight there, because they do need that protein to fuel their recovery. Now, dietitians, you could also link them up if you wanted a more exact. Getting them linked up with a dietitian can also be helpful in that situation.
All right, those are all the questions. And I also want to pause and appreciate the fact that you did this while obviously not feeling well to get in front of the audience. We had over 300 people register. They'll all be getting it through their recording as well. Cannot thank you enough for soldiering through and sharing this great information with the group.
Yeah.
Anything else, Carol, that you want to add to the group? Feel free to send over, and I'll be sure to send that out to everybody in an email. But we cannot thank you enough. Really appreciate it. Do you have your maybe Instagram handle or anything that I can throw in the chat for everybody so they can follow you?
Yeah. I can, if you want to hear, I can even throw it in the
Yeah,
chat.
just go ahead and type it in. There we
Favorites.
go. That way you
Oh,
guys can
and
have constant access and shoot her, DMs and ask questions and send comments, and she can keep you on the right track.
yeah, for some reason it's not letting me type in the chat box, but I can.
Oh, it's okay.
It's CMack_CLE and I'm most active on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn as well, so you could look for me there. But yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ben.
Did I do it right?
That's
Okay, perfect.
yeah, yeah,
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you very
yeah.
much. Thank you again. Get some of your own recovery, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you guys for putting up with my voice. So have a
Have
good night.
a great night. Thank you.